So today's session is the third one in a four-part series of online workshops that we have been organizing with European Alternatives to explore and dive into the topic of collective care in activist and organizing contexts from a variety of different perspectives. So in June, we had our first session with Julia Sujin Noel, where we looked at political emotions and how we experience them. In July, we had Hala Alian, talking about how to enact self-care in a way that is politically grounded. And in today's session, titled Sustaining Societies of Care, the two fantastic academics who are joining us today, Joan Tronto and Deva Woodley, will be having a discussion about the nature of care ethics, how care manifests in different political contexts, both institutional and grassroots contexts, for instance, the movement for Black lives, and how these insights can be applied to activist practices in a critical fashion. And lastly, in September next month, longtime community organizer Adilka Pimentel will be sharing practical examples about how activists and organizers can enact care in ways that enable people to come together and to also make organizing itself a way to practice collective care. So my name is Camilo, and I work with European Alternatives, and with me to support today also, we have Jana and Gavi, who are also from the team. So just to give you a very brief overview of the session today before we get started, the session will be divided in 4 segments. During the first one, Joan will be talking about the nature of feminist and democratic care ethics, as well as about some tools for analysis that it offers. In the second segment, Deva will be talking about care within the movement for Black lives, and also about the nature of abolitionist care, as well as on futurity too. Then after this block, we will have a short 5-minute break. And then after the break, we will come back to the third segment in which Joan and Deva will discuss, we'll talk to one another basically and discuss about the differences and similarities of their approaches. And at the very end, there will be time to open the floor for all of you who are present today to bring up questions. So for this part, as the session progresses today, if you come up with questions, you can always write them to us. So I'll ask you if you can write them to Gavi so we can collect them. But also if at the end you come up with a question, feel free to also raise your hand and then we will give you the floor. Now, before I pass on the floor to Joan, I just want to introduce the 2 speakers that we have today for all of you who don't know them already. So Joan Tronto is a professor emerita of political science at the University of Minnesota and at Hunter College and the Graduate School of the City University of New York. She is a prominent voice in care ethics and political theory, and the concepts that she has formulated, for instance, the very definition of care, have helped to shape the discussion on care and politics worldwide. Some of her most distinguished works are Moral Boundaries, a political argument for an ethic of care, and Caring Democracy, Markets, Equality, and Justice. And we also have Deva Woodley, who is a professor of political science at Brown University. Her research touches upon the influence of public discourse and the political meanings of social and economic matters across various topics, including media, communication, race, imagination, and social movements, and also how these understandings shape democratic practices as well as public policy. She is the author of Reckoning, Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements, and also of The Politics of Common Sense, how social movements use public discourse to change politics and win acceptance. So without further ado, I will give now the floor to Joan.
Thank you, Camilo, and thank you all for being here. And for those of you who are watching later, thank you for joining us. I'm going to use some slides because I'm an academic and I have a lot to say with lots of words, so let's do this. Share desktop 1. Let me get my slides to come up. Wait. That's the wrong one. There it is. That's the right one. There we go. Thanks. Sorry for taking the time. Let's see. Is it not sharing? Yes. There we go. So, I've been thinking about care for a very long time. I began as a feminist in the second wave, thinking about what it was that was the contribution that women made to the world that was going to be ignored if we started to think about the world as simply a world of men. The way the National Organization for Women put it was, women should join men in the mainstream of society. We started to think about, well, what'll be left out if that happens? If all the women go to work, what's going to change? And Berenice Fisher and I met in New York back in the late 80s, and we started to be very discontented with the way that people were talking about care, mostly thinking of it, this is in the mostly white feminist movement, as maternal care, middle class, heterosexual, oriented towards dependence, and really separated from the fact that care is about the work of care as well. Now, notice, by the way, that there are other ways to talk about care, and some people have recognized that care is like Ubuntu, care is like Confucianism, or like some ideas in Confucianism. And African-American traditions have talked about care forever. So it's not that this is completely new, but we decided we would try to think more systematically about this. Can you actually see the slides? Yeah, okay, great. And so what we decided to come up with was this definition. On the most general level, we suggest that care be viewed as a species activity that includes everything we do to repair, maintain, and continue the world so that we may live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave into a complex, life-sustaining web. Wow, that's a mouthful. And it's really complex to think about care this way. The definition is extremely broad, and we meant it to be extremely broad, because people are often, philosophers hate this. They say, well, what are the boundaries of care? Where's the edge of it? And part of the reason we defined it so broadly is because we want to see it everywhere. We want to see that, in fact, care is part of everything we do in life. Care is a practice, it's an activity, as well as a disposition. Often we think of care as kind of an emotion or some kind of sentiment, but it's also the actual work of taking care. Now, on the most general level is this definition, but it also obviously contains care practices that have more specific ends. But the general goal is that we would live lives where we would live as well as possible by integrating all of our caring practices into one whole practice. I've worked with this definition now for decades, and in doing so, I think along the way I've learned some things, and so I want to talk about some of the things I think this definition points towards. First of all, it's really important to recognize that care ethics is relational, to put it that way, or that relationships come before resources. We have relationships with people, with places, with institutions. We have relationships in our community with a nation, if you want to use that language, or some large collectivity. And we have relationships with the physical world, both the natural physical world and the built physical world. It's in the relationships that care is happening. One of the things that happened early on, is often still happens, is that people start to think of care only in dyadic terms. A mother cares for her child, or A cares for B. But very, very rarely is care happening only in a dyad. Much more often it's happening in a community, in a setting. And while there's some care that's local and, very precise, what you do in your own house, it's also the case that that's influenced and shaped by the environment within which that care happens. So the ultimate goal being an integrated practice, an outcome that makes it all the pieces fit together, means that we do have some way to make judgments about what care is about. You know, Hala Aliyan's talk last time about grounded self-care was so important. And at the end, someone asked the question, well, how do we institutionalize this? How do we make it happen? Is there a book? Is there a manual we can use? And the answer I want to give is that no, there isn't a manual, but there are ways to think about caring that are more precise and which make it work better. And what makes it work better is for us to recognize that there are parts of care. We have to care about something. We have to be attentive. We have to notice there's a problem or a need that has to be met in the first place. We have to be in a relation. We have to take responsibility for the care work that has to happen. We have to do that work itself. And fourth and finally, we have to be responsive to the care we've given or received and figure out what's happening and how to go on caring into the future. Those elements, caring about, caring for, caregiving, care receiving, allow us to make judgments about the way care works so that we can pinpoint where the problems are. And finally, it's really important if we think about care relationally to recognize that all of us, all the time, are both giving care and receiving care. You know, the evidence is that children as young as 10 months old have an understanding that after a caregiver has taken care of them, that they can reciprocate that care. If you take a spoon and put it down, the child will pick it up and try to feed you the way you've just fed the child. It seems like care is really hardwired into humans. And the question becomes then, how do we recognize that and make it more central to the way that we live our human lives? Well, there are, though, some resources which are absolutely essential for care. Care is always about power. Because if there's a need that needs to be met, whether it's a need that's essential or a need that's maybe frivolous, there's someone who's going to do it and someone who's going to get the care. And that means that there's an imbalance, and that means there's always a power relation. Furthermore, care is almost always about gender and other forms of unprivilege. Because as human societies have evolved, some people, women, people of color, people who are of a different ethnicity, people who are put in positions as servants, people who are put in positions as slaves, all those people end up doing a disproportionate amount of the care work, especially the unpleasant, dirty care work. Care is devalued globally. Even the ILO says women are overrepresented in the health and care sectors where approximately 7 out of 10 jobs are occupied by women. And all of those jobs are less well paid than any other jobs. Finally, care always involves time, and time is a resource that is perhaps the most important one for us to think about that we hardly ever do. We always, as activists, we feel a sense of urgency, but if we don't take time to care, we're going to do something wrong. Okay. Now, I've always recognized that there are some very serious dangers of bad care. Care is always in danger of becoming paternalistic. That is, that the caregivers think they know more and that their judgment about what the person needs are the ones that should prevail. And there's always the danger of care becoming parochial, that is, narrow, that caregivers and care receivers restrict care only to themselves and those who are closest to them without thinking about the broader consequences and effects of giving good care to themselves. If you overfeed these people, are other people not getting enough food, for example, right? There's a parochialism that comes about thinking our care needs are more important than someone else's. So this is a concept of care that has broad applicability in the world. But care is a concept, it's not a theory. And care can be bad on a social level. Every society always have a theory of care. Even unjust societies have a theory of care, right? And so the question is, how do we recognize and create just and appropriate forms of care rather than unjust ones? Let me give you some examples of bad or unjust care. Back in 1995, at the very beginning of care ethics, Uma Narayan published a wonderful essay about care as a discourse of colonialism. She pointed out, colonialism wasn't sold to the British population, especially the women, because it was about exploiting resources. It was sold to them because it was about civilizing the poor people who needed civilization. Slavery as a social order has a theory of care. It is some people are good and some people are less, and the ones who are good need the other ones to take care of them so they can do their important whatever it is they do. Evelyn McConnell Glenn writes about this way of peace. Some people are forced to care. And disability scholars have argued that care sometimes constructs the disabled as less than equal, and it makes a form of bad care as well. So we always have to be looking out for this bad care, which means that we need a framework which is going to allow us to make a judgment about what care is bad. That's why, it's taken me a long time to realize this. The appropriate frame, I think, for care has to be a framework of democracy. Why? Because democracy requires us to make a commitment to equality, to inclusion, to pluralism, to equal dignity, to human rights, and all of those point to having a democratic system in which everybody has voice. I've defined caring democracy in this way, that the great democratic revolution remains incomplete, because behind those who are still associated with the work of the household, there is no real recognition of their needs. Historically, the exclusion of women and others who care is the unfinished democratic revolution. Charlotte Bunch said, "You don't just add women and stir." And after the 19th century, the inclusion of working class men led to the creation of social welfare systems. And after the 20th century inclusion of women and carers, we would expect that perhaps that society would now recognize the ways in which we have to include women. But this really has been very slow to happen. And this is what the care revolution needs to require. We have to go beyond, you see, an understanding of simple justice. Because while principles of equality emerged in the 18th century, colonialism, slavery, racism, sexism, discrimination by religion, sexuality, marital status, birth status, language, ethnicity continue. So is there something wrong with the principle of equality? No, but societies evolve a way of doing that often roots inequality and status deeply within its way of being. And for care, differences in gender roles have been hardened into spheres of life that make it very difficult to get beyond this. And it produces a kind of bad effect I call privileged irresponsibility. People often find this the most useful concept in care ethics because it really helps us to think about what people are doing wrong. One of the greatest dangers from a care perspective, unequal status, is that it leads to some people thinking they don't have to care. They don't have to do any of the work of caring. Privileged irresponsibility is when some are granted the privilege or the opportunity to ignore the fact that certain forms of hardship that they don't face are passed on to others who do the care for them. And this privileged irresponsibility means that it deepens those who are excused from caring roles and others carry the burden of care. Their privilege, their ignorance, and their incapacities become a way for them to feel as if they don't have to do any of this work. Now, asking everybody to take on care means that some people are going to have to surrender their privilege of not doing care. And surrendering privilege to become equal always feels like a deprivation. So it's never a question of simple justice. Some people are always going to feel aggrieved when you ask them simply to be equal and to give up the privilege they've had. So democratic caring requires us to redefine democracy itself as a way of understanding how we allocate care work in society. It requires that we reorganize caring responsibilities so that everybody has to take on caring responsibilities. And it means that we have to be democratic about how to do this. Because if we just say, okay, now we're going to all be equal in care and don't give power to the people whose voices have previously been excluded, they will continue to be excluded. So we have to somehow limit hierarchies, make room for everybody, and be open to everyone. So once we can do this, then we are able to begin to make change. Now, for my money, and we don't really have enough time to go into this in great detail, but I would say to you that the real problem is that right now we're living in a system which I would call wealth care. What we care about is money, not money even, but wealth. And the whole society has been organized to generate more and more wealth. People don't matter, wealth does. And if we live in a society where that happens, then the kind of care that people need from one another, that the planet needs from all of us, gets short shrift. Wealth care relies upon a false sense of assumptions about the economy. It presumes that the free market is real, but it isn't. It presumes that if everybody participates in the economy, then whatever happens to them is their fault, which means that people end up being unequal. It means that citizens end up being unequal and passive, and it means that nothing moves forward. Caring democracy, on the other hand, requires us to be active and to think about the fact that we have to care for others, care for ourselves, and make ongoing relationships among us work. So in Caring Democracy, I argued that there are certain kinds of ways in which people get out of caring by arguing that they're involved in protection or production, or that they take care of their own people, or that they are engaged in charity. But if we were to collect all these passes, all these injustices, and make sure that everybody cares, we would end up with a much more equal society. Now, how does this help activists? Well, I think now to help activists, we would think about this. We can frame political issues in this way. Who do you want to reach? And what kinds of caring do those people engage in every day? You know, care is real. It's what we do in our everyday lives. And to talk about politics in a way that's not about the economy, but about what it means for you to try to be able to live your life, that's what really reaches people. And we can also use this framework to analyze how well or how badly organizations are doing internally to be able to care for themselves, to care for activists, and to care for the people that they say they are helping. And finally, using this analysis also allows us to recognize how well or how badly we're acting to balance the needs of ourselves with the needs of others. Because as people engaged in trying to make change, if you completely burn out, you're going to be of no use to anybody. But how do you make those judgments about how much work you can do for yourself versus how much work you can do for others? What frequently happens is people push themselves so hard and so far to the edge that then there's a huge blow up and people end up not being able to speak to each other in an organization and so on. But if we think from the start that we need to care for ourselves as well as for others, that we need to recognize that other people need care too, when we recognize that part of what we're doing when we frame our political ideals is framing a way to think about care, then we're able to really make a connection between ourselves, the organizations we're in, how we're working with others, and our ultimate political goals. So that's all I want to say at this point, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Joan. That is very, very interesting. Now I will pass the floor to Deva.
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much, Joan. As always, so much to think about. I too have a slide, so you'll have to bear with me as I do the thing where I share a screen as well. Here we go. Okay, so this is jumping off from a lot of the work that Joan has talked about, not only in this talk, but actually in the world, right? Being an academic of a subsequent generation, I was raised on Joan's work, so it's an honor to be in conversation with her. So I want to talk about the politics of care as a method toward political futurity. And I think about care as not only an ethic, but also a politics. That is a way of organizing our political meanings, thought, and action. So I think of ethics as a kind of internal organizing structure, but I think of politics as more outwardly oriented. And so that's what I want to talk about. I should say first that I was not, my field of study is social movements, public meanings, political persuasion, and political participation. I had not thought seriously about care until I started to do field research in the Black Lives Matter movement. And the reason that it became so salient for me is because it was so salient within the movement. And so I thought, what do I make of this? And how should I think about this? And so what happened as I was sort of interviewing organizers and activists in that movement between 2016 and 2019 is that they articulated a political philosophy to me that I ended up calling radical Black feminist pragmatism. And as Joan indicated, Black feminism as an ethic has always thought of care as central. And so I had to re-engage with those works of political philosophy in order to understand what it was that organizers and activists were saying to me. So really briefly, I'm going to talk to you about what radical Black feminist pragmatism is, how the politics of care is one of the most unique and important parts of radical Black feminist pragmatism, and then talk about the ways that we can think about a politics of care as a basis for political decision-making, in addition to an ethical structure and a set of dispositions. And when I think of it as a basis of political decision-making, I don't mean just in terms of ethical judgment. I mean as a political lens through which to see problems and imagine solutions. So that's roughly how my talk is going to go. Then I want to talk a little bit about what a politics of futurity is, and what its orientation is. Those of you who are involved in European Alternatives as an organization will be very familiar with what I'm going to say, because your description of your organization is very much in line with this politics of futurity that I want to emphasize. Okay, so first, radical Black feminist pragmatism. Can you all, are you seeing the, maybe I should put it to full screen here. Yes, okay. So when I started writing this book, I thought that I was going to be writing a kind of really brief book on what I thought was the unique organizational structure of the Black Lives Matter movement, which seemed to sort of solve some of the problems in the literature on social movements about whether or not new social movements were more about lifestyle and decentralized hierarchy, and traditional or old social movements were more about national organizations and centralized hierarchy. The Black Lives Matter movement had a kind of semi-federated structure that mirrored kind of like the Articles of Confederation or something in the American sort of political development sense, which meant that there was a sort of umbrella organization at the center, but all of the other dozens of organizations who affiliated or disaffiliated and reaffiliated had their own autonomy and used the umbrella organization as basically a clearinghouse for resources, idea sharing, decision-making, and networking. And when I say networking, I don't mean it in necessarily the kind of corporate get-ahead sense. I mean literally creating networks of communication and coordination. Okay, but then when I started talking to people within the organization, they started saying to me a very deep kind of political philosophy. And that became actually the center of the work that I wrote, because it was so interesting to me that as I was talking to people in many different organizations, in different regions of the country, in different levels of leadership, they kept telling me the same thing. And it was that the work was built in these principles. So I'll briefly go through them. The first set of principles, or the first four principles, are those that are its kind of scaffolding. And this is pragmatic imagination, and that is imagination toward action. That is, the political imagination of the movement is not about make-believe, but it seeks to be unconstrained by the notion of what is possible now, and instead tries to think about what can be made possible, right, through the work of the movement in the future. The second is this notion of social intelligence. And basically what this means is it's about connecting old habits, existing beliefs and customs, as well as institutions, to new purposes and conditions. This is the kind of thing that I take from both sort of John Dewey and Audre Lorde about the master's tools. What is it that we can do? How is it that we can utilize the things as they exist, right, by breaking them down, breaking them apart, challenging them, using them for purposes other than what they're intended, in order to make connections between the world as it is and the world that we seek to build. This is the sort of thought behind social intelligence. Then there's democratic experimentation. This is about boldly experimenting. So for example, the notion of abolition is one that requires democratic experimentation. Abolitionists will tell you they do not know exactly what the world will look like, right, without police and prisons. But the purpose of the context of abolition is to experiment with ways of getting from here to there. And you have to be brave enough to experiment democratically, that is, taking into account the voices of people who, giving special weight is to people who have been excluded up to this point, but the voices of people who have been impacted by the structural relations as they exist today, right? So democratic experimentation is key. Not to say that you fully understand what the world will look like at the end point, or that there's some perfect structure or set of structures that can be built, but instead thinking of one of the key facilities, one of the key important aspects of what democracy is, as an experimental aspect, something that we can do together and try to see if it works, to see if it, and it may work for a certain amount of time and then reach the end of its usefulness as exogenous factors change, right? I would say that this is the case with liberalism, for example. So yes, democratic experimentation. The next sort of scaffolding or grounding political concept of radical Black feminist pragmatism is the liberatory aim. This is the notion that freedom is really central, right? Not the kind of libertarian freedom of being free from connections to others, unconstrained by both social connection and the state, but instead a liberatory aim. This is the notion of getting free. It is the practice of marronage, right, of being in flight, because we know that the set of structural and systemic relations that have characterized modernity take a lot of maneuvering in order to be released from, to be deconstructed, to be unmade, right, in order to make something new. So the aim of the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think many movements in the 21st century, is to really reconceptualize what freedom is, and especially with emphasis on how to get free, on the fact that it's always a process, that we don't arrive at a utopian end state, but instead it's a question of how do we develop ethics, practices, organizations, relationships, ideologies, right, political philosophies that enable us to continue to get free by unmaking the world as it is and rebuilding a world that we envision together democratically. Okay. Now, when I say this democratic envisioning, it might sound unitary. It's not, right? always have in mind that democracy is agonistic. People are going to have conflicts. Part of the question of how you create a democracy that functions is how you deal with those conflicts, how voices are both solicited and weighed together, how pluralism is valued, et cetera, right? So that's always in the background. I'm not talking ever about a kind of unitary monolith. People are fractious. People have attitudes, right? People have different priorities, right? The question of democratic political action, including the action of social movements, both internally and externally, is how we manage that, right? That is the activity of democracy. And that's part of the reason why we never reach the end state, why it's always a process of getting free, right? Okay, so then we come to the sort of substantive claims of the political philosophy. So the first four claims are kind of the intellectual scaffolding. These are the substantive claims. One is the social ontological claim that Black being matters as such. This was really important to the movement. And I want to emphasize that it's really important, generally speaking, because one of the things that liberalism contains, both on the left and the right, and which sort of socialist ideas also sometimes contain, is that there's some kind of unitary, or should be, right, some kind of unitary humanity on behalf of which we can act, and that we can subsume differences in such a way that we can sort of look away from them because they're not really significant. There's some sort of illusion, right? But this way of arguing allows us to look away from the world as it is actually experienced by people, right? It doesn't have to be a kind of essentialist claim about race or gender or sexuality or region or whatever in order for those differences to be very important to the lived experience that people have. Right. And when I say lived experience, I don't just mean like their subjective importance to this people's sort of identity, although that's important. I mean actually to the ways that the social structures and systems in the world impact their lives, right? So solving for more just relationships really means paying attention to politically significant differences. So one of the things that movement really wanted to do was to create a situation in which you couldn't abstract away from the fact of Black death as such, right? That you had to say it every time you reference the movement, because otherwise people would tend toward vague universalist platitudes that would not allow movement to solve for X, okay? So that really matters. And this was a debate that was had very early on, right? In the very first meetings that they had, they were like, we're going to call it Black Lives Matter. And other people in the room were like, are we really going to do that? Like, what? Like, that seems kind of divisive, or people will think it's exclusive. And the reasoning for why it won out in the end was precisely this notion that white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, all of these things want us to talk in these useful universalist terms so that they will look away from the lived experience of people's lives who are systematically undervalued. So we want to say it every time, okay? So that's one thing. The next is the radical mandate. This is a notion from Mary Hooks on Southerners on New Ground, of the organization Southerners on New Ground. And what she says is that the purpose of movement is about, and she says, to avenge the suffering of our ancestors, earn the respect of future generations, and to be transformed in the service of the work. This is again this notion of what it takes to get free and what it takes to be a world builder. On the one hand, it's about having a view in which you are in an interdependent relation with both those who have come before you and those who come after, right? Which is something that's also grounding in Black feminist political theory, but also that you are transformed by the work of political change that you are doing. It goes along with this notion of democratic experimentation and political imagination. It's not the case that we start out in movement work as the subjects that we need to be to make the changes that we want to see. We are transformed in the learning that we do along with others in the work of movement to be the kinds of people who can do the kinds of things that we will imagine and enact. I hope that's sort of clear. Next is the intersectional lens. This is this notion again of how we think about organizing across difference, right? The notion that oppressions are not additive, but that they intersect, and given material, social, psychological, right, et cetera, political consequences, the different social relations and economic and political relations that are extant in the world will fall on different bodies in different ways. And we need to be attentive to that in order to understand how to respond. I often think about sort of this intersectional lens as viewing political life as a kind of knot of structural relations. And if you've ever sort of, tried to untie a very snarled knot, right? Like, so think of a ball of yarn that is like very snarled or something like this, or has a section that is. What an intersectional lens says is that you have to really pay attention to how those intersections are connected. Because if you just go about with a theory, right, of this is where that we should cut the knot, what you'll end up doing is making the knot worse, severing the skein altogether, making it completely impossible to untangle. So what an intersectional lens allows you to do is to be more precise. It allows you to try to pull at the knot in places that will actually help you untangle it, right? Next is the margin to center ethic. This is also quite foundational to Black feminist thinking, particularly developed in the work of bell hooks. This is about, and also sort of on a global level, you could think about Enrique Dussel, who talks about periphery to the center, right? It's thinking about analyzing political problems, not from the perspective of those who already have power and privilege, but instead from the perspective of those who are farthest from power and privilege, because you will see how the actual impacts of systemic injustice operate in people's lives. And that there's often a difference between how those systems interact in people's lives and how they actually are sort of juridically spelled out, right, or mandated, okay? And the last, and the subject of the rest of this talk, is the politics of care. This was the most surprising part and thing to me. And this is basically this notion that politics is not only about reaching your goals, developing ideology, learning about intellectual resources, learning about economic resources, but instead it's oriented toward need, congregation, and community, rather than solely a rights or resources framework. And what I found that when people were talking to me about the politics of care is that it had 6 elements. This is the acknowledgement that oppression is traumatic, that it actually has impacts on our psychologies, the ways that we live our lives and respond, the ways that we may respond to being organized or having the capacity to organize, and that in order to actually get people to be able to act and act in concert, this has to be acknowledged, right? It's also the centrality of interdependence. And this is something that's really important. And it's another way of saying what Joan was saying about care itself, is that it's never dyadic, right? It's a set of relationships. And this is partly a kind of critique of Western political philosophy, because in Western political philosophy, you're often thinking about either you're in a context of independence or you're in a context of dependence, right? In the reality, the empirical reality of interdependence is somehow organized out of our thought, right? But interdependence is actually the state of all life, right? It is the real state of all things. And so the question is, how is it that we develop not only an ethics, but a political disposition that takes that reality into account, right? All right, so oppression is traumatic, and we need to think that through in terms of people's capacity and how to organize people. Interdependence is the real state of all life. So creating a dichotomy between dependence and independence is inaccurate and will come to grief, as Nietzsche says. Next is the embrace of unapologetic Blackness. This is a variety actually, I have another slide that I can go on to. I have a slide that actually has this all together. Yeah. So this is a variety of unapologetic humanness. This is a rejection of respectability politics, basically. You don't have to be a perfect subject in order to matter, right? You don't have to be perfectly innocent in order not to be thrown in a jail cell and allowed to rot. You don't have to be a perfect victim in order to receive resources. You don't have to have never done anything wrong in your life in order to be deserving of dignity, right? We can be unapologetically human and still matter, okay? The next is the defense of Black joy. This is really important because so much, especially, perhaps globally, but certainly in the United States, so much of the way that Blackness is depicted as either as the subject who is in need of apology, to approach things from the perspective of apology, or to approach everything with seriousness from the point of view of dejection, abjection, or heroism, right? Something like this. But this movement understands joy as a political resource and a really important part of care, right? The care is not just the sort of like unpleasant physical work of care. It's not only a kind of disposition of caring about, but it's also in joy. So this was practically sort of practically expressed in movement spaces by creating moments, even within planning sessions or whatever, where people could sing, where people could, have a dance break, where organizations would plan parties, and the purpose of the party was just a party. It was about just using joy as a source of resilience, self-care, and recommitment to community. There's something that happens in a joyful space, and Emile Durkheim talks about this as collective effervescence. This is one of the reasons that religious spaces are so powerful. It's not just about the doctrine or belief. It's about the joy people feel of connection in those spaces. And so this movement deliberately cultivates that sense of joy as a resource for political connection, resilience, commitment, etc. The last aspect of the politics of care is this notion of abolition, restoration, and repair instead of punishment. This is basically a politics of care means that everyone matters and no one is disposable. And so if no one is disposable, then abolition becomes a context, a lens through which you have to see the world. Because abolition is about how is it that we create the conditions under which we can prevent harm, as much harm as possible. And then when harm is done, that we can try to repair that harm, that the focus can be the repairing of that harm rather than the punishment of the person who has been harmed. Because the punishment of the person who has been harmed often does not accord with care for the people who have been harmed, if that makes sense, right? So abolition is really central to a politics of care because it's also about how is it that we develop, one, a disposition toward people that no one is disposable, but also processes so that we can actually prevent harm or have a process of restoration and repair when harm is done, right? Both inside our organizations, but also in the world as it is, right? What are the things that actually reduce harm? What are the things that actually reduce violence? What are the things that actually reduce interpersonal harm? right? We have data about these things, but almost none of our societies are actually geared to accord with the data that we have. People are less likely to do harm to one another when, surprise, surprise, they have the things that they need, okay? People are less likely to do harm to one another when they are in relationships of community, right? People are less likely to do harm to one another when they have resources that can help them with trauma, mental illness, right? General health. In the United States case, we're, of course, in a situation in which we do not have universal health care. And so many people do not have access to basic doctor's appointments, certainly not mental health, right, et cetera. One of the most dramatic things that reduces harm in the American context is extending a program called Medicare, which is basically healthcare provided by the federal government, which goes to the poorest Americans. When that is expanded to include a larger chunk of people, we see crime go down, right? In dramatic ways, much more dramatic than, for example, adding police. Okay? So this is about how do we make a world in which we actually reduce harm. Okay, so this notion of a politics of care I found extremely important, not only because it characterized something about the movement that I thought was unique, but because it taught me something about the concept of care. And one of the things that I understood from my own training, even though, right, I had read these works of feminist political theory, was that care is largely organized out of how we think about politics in Western Enlightenment traditions, right? And even in feminist political theory, we think of it in terms of ethics rather than a way to organize politics, often. With the notable exception of the canonical work, right? Joan's canonical work with Berenice Fisher and others. But the need for care is a social fact. And what this movement, what the Black Lives Matter movement adds theoretically, is that we just deserve care as a consequence of mattering. And in this, I just want to read something to you because it was a real revelation for me to understand that the name of this movement really had philosophical heft. And so let me just read this to you. Let us pause to consider this. To matter, by its primary definition, is just to exist as physical substance that has mass at rest. But it also means to be of importance or significance and to have content and substance that is distinct from manner and form. A matter is also an affair under consideration. The reason for distress, or the pus that seeps from a wound, these are all definitions of matter. One does not matter because of the way one behaves or the way one's form is made or appears. One does not earn the properties of substance and significance via motivation or avocation. One is not bequeathed this ability to matter by right. There are explanations for the reasons that we matter, but no justification is necessary. We simply do matter, and so we deserve care. This is also the basis of abolitionist politics. You don't earn the right to matter. You don't matter because you have rights. You just matter because you exist. And so, what does that do to our political philosophies? What does that do to our political action if we understand mattering in this way? This means that care is not just a sentiment, and it's not just a posture of deference or coddling. In fact, it doesn't have to be one at all. Instead, care hews closely to its dictionary definition, and that is, in its noun form, the provision of what is necessary for health, welfare, maintenance, and protection. The provision of what is necessary for health, welfare, maintenance, and protection. Now, imagine a politics that is organized around this simple definition. How transformative that is. You don't have to get complicated. You do not have to look into anybody's heart. Just this simple definition. If your politics is organized around the health, welfare, maintenance, and protection of beings who matter. Full stop. That transforms our entire approach. And so taking that seriously, I think, is what we ought to be doing in terms of thinking about the world building of movements. Okay? As a verb, to care means to feel concern for or interest in something, to attach importance to it and provide for the needs that one observes. In this way, the politics of care begins with the conviction that it matters when whole populations are hurting from harms inflicted by the ways we have structured society, whereby some people are systematically advantaged and others are systematically disadvantaged. It matters that we have designed politics so that some voices are much more likely to be heard and have influence than others, though all may bear an equal claim to citizenship. It matters that in the case of the United States, we have a grotesquely huge carceral system that consigns some people to not only be confined in cages, but also to social death. That is the denial of full personhood and the mark of disposability. And so to care means to take seriously not only the material deprivation, but also the pain that accompanies these political realities, and to work to mitigate the causes and repair the devastating results of the way that we have arranged the world. Okay? So for me, this is what I learned about the politics of care, the way that people were understanding it in the Black Lives Matter movement, and it really transformed my whole relationship to politics, to be honest with you. This is in part because I think liberal forms of political care, like welfare and humanitarianism, are premised on the notion, which are the terms that I was steeped in, what I understood before really sort of thinking it through with folks in movement. It's premised on the notion of hierarchy, in which the exclusion of the unqualified or undeserving is allowed, right? You hear people who work in human rights contexts talk about this all the time, how resources are pegged to certain people, certain populations in very narrow or prescribed ways that don't necessarily accord to their needs at all and are not able to respond to what is actually happening on the ground, right? So for example, I was recently at a talk with someone who worked with human rights organizations in Central Africa, and the ways that humanitarian money are pegged toward this money is supposed to go to the LGBT community, and this money is supposed to go to child survivors of war, and this money, and so whatever is happening in terms of the suffering of the people on the ground is immaterial, right? So for example, she was talking about men who had been the victims of rape in war, but didn't identify as LGBTQ people, for example, would not then be able to get resources, right? Or children who were orphaned, but were not orphaned because of the war, would not be able to get resources. So this sort of framework in which we peg resources to these highly conscripted and juridical categories is a kind of, it's an excess of liberalism, basically, okay? Let's see. So let me talk to you then about this notion of futurity. The point here of futurity is that if we reorganize politics in this way that I talked about, based on the simple definition of care, then it becomes a lens through which, a method by which we can move toward a politics that is, like you all talk about European alternatives, about imagining, demanding, and acting a world that we can actually build. Futurity is the quality or state of being of or concerned with the prospects and possibilities of a future time, event, or renewed and continuing existence. Futurity is concerned with the process of becoming, right? It is an approach, a perspective, a framework for thought and action. It is the conviction that the part of the story that we are living is not and cannot be the whole of it. paired with the determination to affect the terms on which renewed and continuing existence will be experienced. Futurity is a disposition toward politics in which we actually believe that the world can be different than what it is today. This is a really important designation, particularly in political science, but I also find this in politics in general, is that it's not just a matter of probabilities. It's not just a matter of what is possible at this moment. It's a matter of what we can make possible through our collective action, thinking, learning, redefinition, and reorganization of our ideas and priorities. It is also the conviction that, and people are often kind of blown away when I put it this way, the conviction that we're not sort of doomed to the world as it is, that 2080 should be as different from 1980 as 1980 was from 1880. That this is something that we can have. It's not utopian. It's something that has already been accomplished, right? So the question is, how is it that 21st century world builders are able to make the kind of impact that 20th century world builders were able to make? They won't be able to create a world that is perfect. That world is not in the offing, but they will be able to make a real material difference, and also a difference in meaning and perspective, a difference in the way people are able to experience their lives and their ability to thrive in a way that really is impactful, profound, and significant. And I think that that is one of the things that is so important about movement work, is this understanding of futurity in this way, is that it's not about each battle. It's about the way that we reshape meanings and expectations, the way that we're able to take actions in this moment that prepare us for what is possible in the next moment. I'm all done.
Thank you, Deva, so much. Thank you both of you for such insightful, actually, presentations. Also in the spirit of care and rest, now I will invite everyone to go on a little break for 5 minutes, so you can also gather our thoughts as well, and then we'll come back for the second part of the event. Paddling back to the session. So now on the third segment of today's session, it's a time for both of you to exchange with one another. I have a couple of questions that maybe can kickstart the conversation, but you don't have to address them directly if you already have something else that you would like to address. But I would just like to ask to start with, how do you see your ideas realized in practice? And also, what determines and shapes your hopes for the future of successful organizing? So now the floor is all yours.
Would you like to go first, Joan, or me?
No, you could. Why don't you answer Camilo's questions? Or you can go first.
Sure. So in the question of how I see this in practice, I would say in many ways, but I think one of the things that I see organizationally is changes in sort of the structure of organizations. One of the things that I've noticed in Black Lives Matter organizations that have now, are now a decade old, are that often their leadership structure changes. Many have gone to a co-leadership model inside the organizations, so that there's not only one executive director, but instead there's a pair who share responsibilities, and also makes it so that one person is not solely responsible for taking decisions, handling everything that's going on in the organization, but instead that labor is shared. It makes it more sustainable over time. So that's one really practical organizational thing that I see that's internally focused. In terms of external focus, I think that one of the things, and I'm not sure that movement has sort of understood exactly how to deal with this yet, or developed a kind of strategy around it, is that there's a real tension between base building and service work and policy and electoral work, right? There's a real tension between these things. And often we see this in the sort of distribution of resources. So this is not necessarily in the Black Lives Matter movement, but recently there has been a big conflict in the United States in the abortion rights movement between the national organizations who spent a lot of money working on policy at the federal level. So that means lobbying politicians, right, going to Congress, trying to get laws passed, bringing legal cases, right? But they are cutting back on actually providing the service of abortion as healthcare, right? And so abortion funds, which what they do is direct service, have sort of raised a cry about this and saying, like, look, we understand the policy work is really important, but the actual care, right, the actual service is also really important. And the Black Lives Matter movement, it's a tension between base building and that policy and electoral work, right? And so one of the things that I think that people are taking really seriously in terms of the politics of care is having conversations about reorganizing and reorienting where resources are going, right? But through having conversations about what constitutes care, right? Building the foundation for a thriving society, and also what counts as building power, right? Through a care perspective. And in order to build power via a politics of care, it's about creating these healthy communities where interdependence is acknowledged and where the actual work of care is able to be completed, is able to be done, right? So that can create a reorganization of priorities. So those are two ways in which I see a politics of care having an impact. And in neither case is some sort of perfect thing happening, but instead it's a question of reorienting your ideas and your priorities over time.
And I see care kind of, if you let me use this language, sprouting up everywhere. And I think that's a really important thing for us to recognize, that people who are working in architecture and engineering are suddenly recognizing how important care is to what they do. The definition that Deva gave was so beautiful. The simple definition of just care is making sure that everybody is well taken care of, right? That it's, I forget the health, welfare, maintenance, and protection. Care is the provision of what's necessary for that. That involves everything, everybody. And it's so interesting that people are beginning to recognize that. So some political parties and some political leaders in different countries around the world are beginning to see this. Schools are beginning to organize curricula around care. The mayor of Bogota wanted to organize the transportation system around the idea of making sure that care was equally distributed for not just the people who are rich, but the people who do the hard work of caring. So that's one thing I see. The other thing I see is happening is that people are coming to recognize how much hierarchical ways of thinking are fundamentally damaging to the capacities of care, and for that matter, to the capacities to live well. So the more democratically oriented people are becoming, I mean, the old systems of democracy aren't really very democratic, and people are becoming to understand that much more carefully. And as they do, democracy leads to people understanding the centrality of care. An example, the Chilean constitution that was proposed failed. There were 390 some provisions, and as some political scientists said, that gives you 350 reasons to vote against it, right? But the process of who was in that commission was really democratic and included people from all walks of life and all parts of the society. And what they came up with was a constitution in which care featured in many, many, many interesting ways. Cares for the indigenous people, care for the environment, care for workers who do domestic work, everybody, care for health, and so on. Everywhere there was care in that. The more democratic we become, I think the more caring we become too. And so I see that as another dimension of where the care message is getting out and will kind of deepen itself as it goes along.
And I just also want to say, as an outside observer, as a scholar of social movements, right? Like, I'm not an organizer. I try to be very clear with that, around, like, with everyone, my colleagues, but also when I'm speaking to organizers. But I think it gives me a really important perspective, because one of the things that I want to say about that democratic process in Chile and the constitution that failure is not necessarily a failure for movements, right? So the idea is that if an entire society spends all that time crafting all those provisions, even if, right, where care features in each thing, even though, right, the whole thing doesn't pass and become the law of the land, everyone has the public meaning of every part of that has changed, right? People's expectations of what workers require, what indigenous people are owed, what counts as politicized, all of that changes, right? And what we see sort of from if you sort of zoom out, right, and look at the impact of social movements over time, you see that the initial moments when people are fighting for crafting philosophies, writing the book, right, like that is the moment that is the preparation, right, for the transformation that can occur, because new ideas actually take quite a long time to be able to be manifest, right? People have to think about them for a long time. People have to begin to see experiments in them for a long time. It has to change what people think of as political before it can seem to make sense to enough people in order to be implemented, right? So, I mean, I think that's the case in Chile, but I think that's the case everywhere, because, you know, the penetration of care into politics and professions, that's not accidental. One of the first things that happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, at least in the United States, this probably happened globally, is that in 2014, along with the circulation of all of those videos of killing, right, and death, right, was the circulation, the sort of like rediscovery of the Audre Lorde quote about self-care. The very notion of self-care didn't exist, right, in popular culture at all, right, before that moment. And even though self-care has been commodified in a variety of ways, right, it's also the case that it's brought back, it's revivified, revitalized this discussion about care as something that is politicized, right? All over the world. It's why we're having this conversation right now. It's why it's starting to appear in curriculums. It's why it's starting to appear among urban planners and architects. It's why it's starting to, right? Because people have come around to the notion that actually care is politicized. And so it has to be one of the lenses, even the main lens through which we see whatever we're doing in the world and how we make an impact in the world. And that really matters, which, you know, can be hard to see when we're in movement spaces and we're fighting for particular goals, right? And the sort of win-loss ratio is not like what we would like it to be, right? But the truth is, right, the transformation of society is a generational project, and we can already see how that is happening.
That's really both inspiring and encouraging, and I think accurate as a way of talking about how these things are moving forward. I have a question for you. As you were speaking about the movement for Black Lives, it almost sounds as if you're speaking about it in the past sometimes. And I want to ask you where you think things are now.
The movement is ongoing. I'm just not directly in the spaces anymore. So for me, sort of like being in organizing spaces is in the past tense, but those and the people who I knew in those spaces are often not in those spaces anymore or not in the same ways, not because they've exited the movement, but because a decade is a long time, right? Like people who were 25 in 2014 are 35 now, right? And so that is a big sort of like difference in terms of life circumstances. So this is what I mean. Many of the co-directors of organizations where I interviewed people are people who I either don't know or who were very junior in the organizations when I was there. But the thing about the movement is that most of those organizations still exist, which is a huge accomplishment, to be completely honest. And most of them are actually better resourced today than they were before. It's just that I'm not as intimately involved with them as I once was.
That's great. Can I ask you some more questions?
Sure.
So
yes, I want to ask you questions too, but you go first.
Okay. Let me ask you a question, then you can ask me one. But
okay.
One of the things that I've found so profound about your work is the way you use this language of to matter.
Mm.
And there's something so basic and fundamental about mattering that it's such a beautiful way to capture this notion of interdependence, the ways in which there's something so basic and real and physical about care.
Right.
And of course, the other thing about it that you didn't talk about is the way you can expand it, right, to the whole world, right? It's not, matter isn't only just people that matter, it's also quite literally matter.
Yes.
And we can talk about all those things that way. Now,
yeah.
Here's the harder question, though.
Okay.
Another thing that you talk about really profoundly is the idea of harm and the ways in which harm is one of the things that we have to somehow overcome.
Mm-hmm.
But we do harm to matter all the time, right?
Yep.
We transform it, we do harm to it. And the question I want to ask you, and this comes partly out of my own obsession with the fact that there's so much bad care and so much of what happens that's harmful in the world is passed off as care.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right? And so does matter, or how do you begin to give us a standard for what harms are the really serious harms? How do we begin to unpack harmful care from care that matters or care that is appropriate?
Right. Well, yes, here's where I think empirics are very helpful. Because I don't think there's any philosophical way to make that judgment. I mean, if there is, I'm not going to come up with it, right? Like, I don't know how you do that in the abstract. I think you have to actually deal with facts on the ground. So remember that definition of care that I gave was quite specific, right? Health, maintenance, right? Like these are things that can be measured. These are things that are already measured, right? So that's one aspect of things. It also helps you solve for when the feeling of loss is not an actual loss, right? So my friend Juliet Hooker writes about this all the time, is that like grievance, right, is something that arises, and that you talked about, right? Like grievance can arise in a variety of different contexts, and it arises most virulently often among people who see their privilege, whatever it is, whether it's material, whether it's status-based or whatever, start to recede and for equality to assert itself, right? In a context of care, you take seriously people's grievance, but you don't take it seriously in such a way that equality comes out of the picture. You take it seriously in terms of, we have a real discussion that we need to have about how this grief that you're experiencing, or this grievance that you're experiencing, seems real to you, right? But is not an injustice, right? And that is a real conversation that has to happen. It can't be, I don't think it can be skipped over, right? I think that that is part of a democratic process, is when people are able to get together and talk through the ways in which the things that they experience as loss either are or are not actual loss, right? Because these are things that we can actually know, because we have data on what actually impacts our life chances. We have data on who's more likely to be diseased. We have data on who's more likely to be murdered. We have data on who's more likely to be able to, live in a thriving community, et cetera, et cetera. Like there are things that we know. And so I think that should condition some of our, condition our evaluations of what good and bad care are on the one hand. But then two, I don't think the subjective should be left out of things. This is some data that we actually don't collect very well, but we can collect much better. And that is people's self-reports of well-being.
Yeah.
That also really matters. And people are not, we don't do this as much as we should, but there are some economists that have already sort of started doing this in terms of trying to think about indicators of prosperity, right, that go beyond GDP, right, but instead rely on data about what people can actually do, what their actual sort of material maintenance is, but then also how they self-report their satisfaction with their lives, their connection to community, their ability to do the things that they want to do. That's data that we don't have, but that we can collect. That should also go into our assessment, right, as to whether people have what they need for their health, maintenance, protection, right? So I don't think that's an impossible question to answer. It's just an impossible question to answer in the abstract.
That's right.
Can I ask you my question now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I thought that one of the things that you said that I would just like to hear you expand upon is this key idea that I think is also very, very important, especially for people who consider themselves to be on the political left. This key idea that relationships come before resources, right? And I would just love to hear you sort of expand on that and how we can understand that, in a context of a politics in which we're dealing so starkly with differences in material resources, right? Both sort of domestically within countries, but also globally. Is like, what does that mean that relationships come before resources, and how should we?
Yeah. So it really means that we have to change our set of values about what it is we think about and think of as important. So let's talk for a moment about measuring things. Those of you who aren't American, forgive us, we're going to just use an American example here. The newly presumptive vice presidential nominee from the Democratic Party, Tim Walz, is the governor of Minnesota, where I used to live. And when I lived there, there was a long debate about school lunches and paying for school lunches. And one of the things that they wrote about a lot was the ways in which kids who didn't pay their bill were kind of called out of the line and given a cheese sandwich instead of the hot lunch that was being served to the other kids, and how humiliating and embarrassing that was for the kids. And indeed, the data that people have been using is stuff like, actually, if you feed kids better, they learn better. If they learn better, there's less crime. You can actually cost out how many fewer criminals there would be if everyone got a school lunch, right? Okay, now, I think that's fine. But on the other hand, if you let me use this language, there's also social capital to gain from everybody being served lunch and being taught to eat together and being taught, that there's a way you can relate to other people about food, except to sit at your little table of friends and wolf it down, right? Or trade what you brought to lunch with the other kids. I mean, there are a whole series of ways in which social capital can be, to use that language, which I don't like either, but you can develop a way of getting people to talk to each other, of getting them to socialize over a meal, to take the time to eat together. That would be really a valuable thing to learn in a society that's moved towards, fast food and junk food and so on and so forth. So there are ways in which you can talk about this question from a standpoint of resources, how much more cost effective it is to give them lunch, or you can talk about it in terms of relationships. that one of the things you can do by feeding everyone lunch together is build community. Invite the people whose family is different from the main group in the society to come and bring some spices and serve lunch one day, or explain to the cooks how to make food that's a little different. In the Netherlands, they were doing this in nursing homes, right? They would ask the family to come, of a group of people who had moved into the community but weren't native Dutch people. And they would say, well, here's how we would prepare this food that would make it more appetizing to our elders. And if you do that, you can do all kinds of things. So that's what I mean by putting relationships over resources, that there's a way in which the more we build community, the more we create intergenerational, intergroup ways of experiencing, the larger people's imaginations can become. And as their imaginations, as they can imagine themselves in someone else's place,
Yeah.
then we've created the possibility for a real generous politics.
Absolutely. Yeah. It really makes me think of, you know, the ways in which building community and investigating in community, investing in community is about both building democratic capacity, but also building power, right? It's so, one of the things my colleague Hari Han discovered when she was talking to organizers, and she was particularly talking to organizers around tough issues, particularly in states where the legislature and governor were against them, right? So people who were working on immigration in Arizona and et cetera.
Yeah.
And one of the things that she heard from them was that, the ways that successful organizations started was in community, in building community, not just community that previously existed, but communities that they built, right, around meeting in people's houses and making food together and creating opportunities where people could bring their families and et cetera. And it's because one of the people who she organized said, what it is that this kind of community gives us strength, so that when I walk into a room, or the representative walks into a room with power holders, they don't just see me, they see me and everyone who's standing behind my back, right? And for me, that was such a sort of powerful visual. It's like, community is that thing that gives us power and strength that goes well beyond ourselves, right? Not because of some kind of, something special necessarily in us, although we have, sort of special qualities and talents, but instead it's like, when you're in community, you're walking with all those other people, not because you agree about everything in lockstep, but because you understand all those people to matter, right?
Right.
And so, and that also is a real root for democratic capacity. It really changes the game from one that's about interests, right? Which is the main kind of framework that people think about liberal politics and democracy in, and instead one that's really about, what does it mean if we value everybody here? Right? What does it mean if we value every person here? It doesn't mean we agree with every person here. It doesn't mean I'm going to like the spices in your food per se, right? You know what I mean? But it means that I'm invested in your well-being and your enjoyment in the same way that you're invested in mine. And that's just a really different way, I think, to look at politics and living together. And it is rooted in this notion of care.
Yeah. And Camilo, I want to go back to your question and give you one more example of what I think of as a successful exercise of care. So there was a small town in Minnesota called Pelican Rapids. There are no pelicans in Minnesota, but that's what the town is called. And people from Minnesota is filled with people from other parts of the world who work in the industries of animal preparation. A lot of the kind of sausages and stuff get made in that state. And, like a little town in Minnesota has people speaking 30 different languages because they've come from all over the world. Anyway, they began to notice in this little town that there were more graffiti and there was more, just low-level crime going on. And it was because the people were unaccepting, the white people who were there were unaccepting of the new arrivals, some of who are from Somalia and from other places around the world. And a group of women who were white in the community said, we're going to, we have to fix this. And what they did is they didn't know what to do at first. One lady was driving her car home and she recognized one of her neighbors walking along the street from the grocery store. She picked her up and said, do you need a ride home? Great. Okay. So it became regular. She began to pick her up all the time and she began to hang out with her. Her other friends kind of got unhappy. Why are you leaving us alone? Why are you abandoning us? And what they discovered, these women, what they realized is we can't just think of this as helping them. We have to think of it as all of us in it together. And if it's all of us in it together, then it's going to change. And if not, it won't. And so what they did, this is so ingenious, is they created a set of community meetings, mostly dinners, where they invited not just the new friends, but the old friends, and everybody ate together. And then they organized in the library an exhibit about migration. And they brought the pictures of people arriving at the airport from Somalia, but they also brought the pictures of the people arriving from Norway a century earlier, because those people too had an immigration experience to share. And it was in that mutual sharing of a common experience that they were able to move forward. People in the community started getting along together, even though they came from very different backgrounds. And that's an example of how building community across difference can, in fact, happen. But you have to do it from the standpoint of everybody has something to gain. It's not about grief and it's not about loss. What you said, Deva, that especially hit me about this was that everybody has joy. And figuring out a way to share the joy of everybody's community together is a powerful form of building forward. We often think of care in terms of needs and of sadness, but it's also about joy. And Ethel Tungahan, who writes about the Philippine women in Canada who have organized, says that the most important thing for the women to organize was for them to just be able to laugh together and share the experience of being together in a room with other people who were like them. So these kinds of ways in which we can switch the narratives and talk about these ideas of joy are also really important for this change to happen. Yeah.
I agree. And this is another thing that's really powerful about mutual aid.
Yes.
Because this mutual, and one of the things that happened, I think all over the world, right, during the pandemic, is that you saw this sort of reflowering of this notion and the practice of mutual aid. And it's not just, mutual aid has so many good sort of knock-on effects. One, it's about the mutual provision of needs, right, that the state doesn't provide. But it's also about cultivating a spirit of care and a set of demands for a state or your relationship with a state that you otherwise might not have had, right? Because you wouldn't have otherwise been involved in that provision. But it's also about this notion of creating community and joy, but it's also about creating a flexible community of organization. One of the things about folks who organize around mutual aid is that the moment and the subject of their initial organization is not the limit of what they can then do together.
Right.
In fact, it's just the basis of what they can go on to do together. So for example, in my own community, during the pandemic, there were a variety of people who were gardeners, right? So, we had, we had our little plots of land where we were growing our own gardens, and then it was the pandemic, so we were all home, so we all grew a lot, right? So a lot more than we normally did. And so we were like, what are we going to do with all this excess food, right? And so we got together for the purpose of trying to figure out how to deal with this excess food. Ended up setting up a friendly fridge and a community pantry, but also we grew so much food that we could supply some of it to our local school. So like for the students, so like, maybe our kids were not that excited about it, but we had like a lot of kale that we like kind of gave to, right, the school that they were, so, but the point is that this organization that was just a simple organization of gardeners, right, becomes the basis for political organizing in the town that's still going. So it's about the provision of needs, but then it becomes about who's running for local sort of city council office, who's on the library board and the school board. It's about people who's running for the sort of family court spot that opens up, right? Who is sort of advising on policy for how to keep school lunches free after the federal funding ends, right? And all of this capacity gets generated and built by the community that was made through this simple process of mutual aid and participation.
I will just interject right here. I am enjoying this conversation so much, and I would just like to continue hearing both of you exchanging for like hours. But I just wanted to make a little bit of also space for the audience, since we have a couple of questions from them. So then you can also continue your conversation, but based on these questions as well. So I believe we have one by Rachel Piper. I don't know if you would like to voice your own question, Rachel, or would you
Yeah, sure, that's fine. Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks so much for this talk. It's been really incredible. Something that came up for me, which was linking some of what was said about lack of care being and oppression being traumatic, with also the need to kind of redistribute care. And I think I see a lot of narratives around therapy, which seem like an overcorrective, where what happens is people are told to self-care, set clear boundaries, like sort of remove themselves from the inconvenience of other people, to use Behance like expression. And sometimes this is a form of privileged irresponsibility, I think, to use Joan's expression, which it seems as if people sometimes overly opt out for the sake of their own sort of a single track sort of like self-defining mission where care is an interruption. And what I'm curious about is how we can shift, if you have any thoughts around that, because there's a need to have therapy, there's a need for people to have boundaries, there's a need for people to but I think what ends up happening is those that are already not doing that much care work are like, oh my gosh, I'm such a people pleaser, I'm doing so much care work, and then they like opt out of doing anything. And so I'm really curious about if you have any thoughts about sort of finding the balance there, and the sort of intersectional approach there, which is that, like, yeah, often I think terms like people pleaser were designed for sort of like people who were very, very over functioning for others, but end up being used for people who aren't really doing a lot of care work in the first place. So, sorry, that was a not very clear question, but do you have any thoughts about the sort of therapy narratives marrying up with the sort of need for care redistribution, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
That's a hard question because, as you point out at the, implicit in your question, the language of therapy is a language, it's kind of a language of privilege, right? Or it comes from lots of privileged people have access to therapy, other people don't. And it's another one of these places where there's a huge imbalance in care between people who actually really could use some mental health conditioning and people who can overindulge themselves because they have the resources to do so. How do you balance that? You can't, there's no abstract way to do this. Again, as Deva says, the way to do it is for individuals to kind of, it would really help to have a few trusted friends who could call you out on when you're acting like an overprivileged person. But you have to ask your friends to do that, and then they'll be able to do it, right? If you don't recognize that there's a problem or a potential problem there in the first place, you won't be able to solve it. And of course, everything in capitalist society pushes us towards a form of self-care, which is resource intensive, self-indulgent, overly expensive. And, you just have to recognize that and then you're in a better position to resist it. That's what I would say.
Yes, I agree. But I think, and this is like very hard in any kind of community, or like sort of group setting, but I do think that building in a practice of assessment, it actually really matters, right? So it's not just, it can't just be vibes based, right? Because, you know, so there's two realities. One, we already know because of the way that society is structured, those people who don't do very much care work are going to continue not to do very much care work. They also will have less capacity for care work, right? Like one of the reasons for the persistence of the gender division of labor is not necessarily people's beliefs and principles. People believe in equality, right? But because of the way that gender is constructed, those who are assigned male at birth just have to do less stuff, right, throughout their whole life, and they're less able to do it, right, like because they haven't had any practice. So then they reach the moment of adulthood, and they're like, I believe in equality. I also do not know how to do any of these things. So then they become, you know, it's labor intensive to sort of get people up to speed. But the thing is that you have to invest in that labor. You have to actually make an honest assessment. You have to take into account people's capacity, but your level of capacity can't be the end of the discussion, right? It has to be kind of an element in the discussion, right? Is like, I don't have the capacity to do this right now, is not never ask me to do anything again. Right, it's that we're assessing the level of capacity at this moment, what it takes and whether it's appropriate to grow that capacity, right? Whether I'm willing to do that, and what kinds of investment we need to do or make in order to develop that capacity in me and for the organization, right? That has to be a part of the commitment to the organization, which doesn't mean sometimes we don't need to go off and be alone. Right now, my family is away from my house. And I am so happy, right? Like, I'm so happy they're coming back on Sunday and so delighted that I get to spend this time doing absolutely whatever I want, you know, like, and not caring for anyone. Everybody deserves that kind of time, right? But if you're committed to an organization of whatever kind, right? That means all your time can't be like that. And if you have a disproportionate amount of time compared to others in the organization that's like that, then that requires a redistribution of care. And that's something that can be assessed empirically. But it's always a balancing act. Like we never get to the end of that, right? And it's also the case that at different times in different people's lives, they have different capacity for, you know what I'm saying? It's all dynamic. But the question is, can we create organizations and relationships where we understand this to be a part of what it means to relate together and to be in commitment to one another?
Perfect. I believe there's another question from Hella Bayer. Should I read the question out, or do you want to do it?
I can read it out.
Perfect.
I was curious, listening to you both talking and thinking about how a lot of movement and change can come from either a moment of crisis or an accumulation of structural oppression over time. And there's kind of these different spaces that are kind of the antecedents to creation. And I'm curious about your thoughts kind of in this kind of present moment when we're experiencing such acute suffering and violence. And in general, over, say, the last few years, when we've had these huge moments of collective violence and harm doing, and how does care and kind of orienting oneself through that kind of happen or take place in these kinds of moments of such intense collective distress?
Joan, do you want to go first? I think there's no easy way to solve for that, right? Like immense suffering is, I don't think there's any reason for it. I don't think that there's like, I'm not an arc of the moral universe, but like none of that, right? Like Immense suffering is something that happens in human history, and it is terrible, and it should always be avoided if possible. And it should always be mitigated and ended as soon as possible, right? Like so that's one part of it. I think that how care plays into that in this moment is one, really deepening our analysis and trying to really uphold what it means to have a disposition toward care and a politics of care in this moment. What it really means to challenge people about their grievance while recognizing their grief, right? To challenge people who are concerned about loss of status, moral high ground, perceptions of various kinds, right, in the face of the material suffering of others, right, and how we weigh those things against each other, right, is really important in this moment. It's also really important to acknowledge and understand, though, that one of the things that happens as we try to sort of shape meaning in this moment, or one of the things that can happen and that should happen as we try to shape meaning in this moment, is that we're able to actually recalibrate the terms of debate such that different things become possible in the future, right? So things that were not necessarily possible a decade ago regarding, for example, and right now I'm presently thinking about Gaza, right? Things that were not possible to talk about, right, at all, right, a decade ago, become possible to talk about and talk through in the coming years, right? Because of the meaning we have made in the face of this immense suffering, right? So I think that's the only thing I can say about a kind of politics of care. It's one, helps us, I hope, get really clear about how we're able to assess, right, the suffering that is happening in the world, and to be really clear about it without sort of falling into 20th century tropes of various kinds, but also what that assessment then makes possible in our politics going forward, what we're able to conceive, what we're able to demand, what we're able to build.
And I want to add just one thing that's absolutely brilliant, Deva, but I would add one more thing, which is that the process of reparation is a complicated one, but we have to ask the question, who's responsible for the reparation, right? Who has to take the steps to repair the damage that's been done? And the more broadly that responsibility is shared, the more likely it is to actually happen and happen well. In the US, I think the incapacity of, the fact that states have passed laws forbidding the teaching of critical race theory is a sign of the unwillingness to take any responsibility for reparation. And, it's just an astonishing reality. But it's a very difficult thing to admit that one has any responsibility for the harms that have been committed, either by yourself or by others in your name or by others not in your name. And yet somehow there has to be this kind of reparation. There has to be a way to separate grievance from grief. There has to be a way to do all of that really hard work. And the question of who's responsible for doing it, well, you can't just leave that responsibility to the people who have been harmed. But then who else is going to be involved is a really hard question, and one that we need to make a political question.
So I think there's no more questions from the audience at the moment, but I do have one question myself, if I may ask a last one before we wrap up, so we don't go so much over time. I think you already kind of touched on this a little bit. You've said so many things today, so I'm still kind of like processing much of what's been discussed. But I'm still kind of a little bit hung up on this on the notion of mattering. I really like also this concept, mattering as a way to make it more evident why we must care, right? Because we matter and because we exist. But the question that then arises for me is then how do we draw a clear line between what matters and what doesn't? And here I don't mean like between people, of course, but between people and things, for people and systems. Or like, in other words, how can we define the bounds of this life-sustaining web when hegemony tries to convince us that the tools of destruction are essential for life? So you were bringing up the example of the Constitution of Chile, which is also my home country. So I was like very close to this, and the process was beautiful, right? Like the care was all throughout the process, but at the very end, people decided against it. I think for a variety of reasons, but I think part of the reasons is because they thought that this constitution did not cater to the needs of capitalism, nationalism, for example, which are two things that people still consider important because maybe they're afraid of imagining something different. So here's where I find like I think it's really relevant to use this idea of centering needs, right? Which is what care brings forth. But then how do we negotiate, whose or what's needs are to be cared for, right? And I feel maybe the answer goes around this idea that you were also bringing forth, Joan, of relationships coming before resources. But then how do we convince people of this when they're so alienated from one another, so they don't even know so much what it feels like to have this community, to have this value in relationships? This is a big question, but yeah, I hope you get what I'm trying to get to.
That's a wonderful question, Camilo. Thank you for it. So one of the reasons why I want to recast capitalism as a system of wealth care is because it helps us to see what the problem is, I think, more clearly. That the problem is what we care about now is wealth rather than people, rather than the planet. And it takes a little bit to kind of, I guess I should really write this book about what wealth care is. But the truth of the matter is that we need a politics that talks about the ways in which we currently decide what matters and the politics of what would happen if we actually thought that things like people's lives, animals, plants, the planet mattered. It's a really stark contrast. But it happens at a level, as soon as people say neoliberalism, I think nobody knows what we're talking about. But when we start talking about care on a more concrete level, what is it we're caring about? Then people can begin to make judgments. Yeah, people are really alienated now. And, what's really scary is how many young men are completely thrown for a loop about how to think of themselves as masculine beings in a world where the old values of masculinity, of conquest and beat up the other guy, seem not to be very productive any longer. And we really need to kind of think in community about all of these questions. What makes people stop being alienated is making connections. I mean, that sounds really simple, but it's the reality is you have to figure out ways to make connections. And there are ways for people to be connected to each other that don't fall into the pattern of old-fashioned conceptions of masculinity and femininity, that don't fall into patterns of capitalist consumption, that don't fall into these patterns of domination and subordination. But we have to really kind of work at making those alternatives look, recognizing the joy in those alternative forms of attachments to one another and to the world. And this is the point that Deva makes. It can be done. We can do it.
Well, it's also that like part of the reason for that lack of connection is structural, right? Like one of the reasons that we don't, it's not that like people are unfriendly or something like that, right? It's that in the modern economy, almost all of our lives all over the world are colonized for waged work, Like we don't have that much time to make connections in the way that people used to make connections, in the early 20th century, right? And before that, for better and worse, right? Like, I'm not saying that that's an idyllic time. It wasn't, right? Like, in many ways. But the thing is that it wasn't the expectation that all of everybody's life would be colonized for waged work. And when people's lives are not, right, oriented 100% toward waged work all the time, we just naturally create connections. And we had a natural experience of this during the pandemic, for example, right? When a certain group of people were not then tied, right, to their waged work because it had gone away, because it was, they could work remotely, right, et cetera. A whole proportion of people didn't have their time accounted for in that way. And what they did was reach out to other people. What they did was participate in politics, right? What they, so much of the things that we've individualized, like people don't connect with each other anymore. People are apathetic about politics. So much of that is not an individual characteristic, it's structural. Right? This is one of the things I always say to people about it's not a coincidence that the largest social movement in US history happened during the pandemic when a lot of people didn't have to go to work. Right? People are interested in politics when they have the time to be. Right? And this is the same with, I think, connections, is that so many of our public spaces have been privatized, disappeared, gutted. There are not as many places for people to just wander into to make connections with other people in a more casual way. Even if those places existed, they probably wouldn't have the time, right? So this is a way in which, civil society is really important to invest in. And this is something I think that is not always a focus of our movements, but really has to be. Some of this stuff that people don't think of as political is really foundationally political. Creating these third spaces, public spaces, spaces where people can get together and learn to do things with one another are critically important, because those spaces then become versatile. So whenever I hear people in the sort of, especially in the American politics context, and especially on the left, sneer at people who are getting together for reasons that aren't directly political, but are still creating organizations of commitment, that is a real miscalculation, right? Because those wine moms that you're sneering at, that book group that you think doesn't matter, that those are all spaces that can be repurposed for politics, because those are spaces of community and relationship building. And it's not just that relationships come before resources. I think relationships come before the development of interests, right? The things that we think are in our interests are things that are developed in and through our relationships. So for me, this question of alienation is really central, and I'm so glad that you brought it up, is that investment in those spaces, an investment in a political economy where people have time and space to get together, it's huge.
Absolutely. Thank you for the two very wonderful and insightful answers. I would really like to continue this conversation for a very long while, but I think we have to start coming to an end. So first of all, I just want to thank you both for having taken the time to share this conversation with all of us, and yeah, just
Thank
for being
you.
here, really.
Thank
And
you. Thank you to your group and your
and
work.
also for everyone who's participated today. So hopefully also through things like this, we can start getting closer to being able to recognize the centrality of care, right? And also to develop a political reality that takes interdependence seriously, just to borrow some of the things that you both have said. So I just want to tell you, everyone who's been here today, in case you would like to share also this session with other people, it's being recorded, so we will be uploading it and sharing it broadly within the next few days or maybe a few weeks. And I also want to remind you all that on the 21st of September, we'll be having the last session of this series, which is on practicing collective care and centering interconnectedness. So also this ending is a nice leeway into the last session, and it will be hosted by Adilka Pimentel. So I think that will be it for now. So I wish you all a beautiful rest of the weekend and a beautiful rest of the summer as well. And I hope there's other chances that we can continue this conversation at some other point.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joan. And yes, please write the book on wealth care.
Thank you, Deva. Thank you all very much. This was great. Okay, see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.